This
future.
conference will now be recorded.
So cooperation to address these environmental challenges and human challenges that we are facing, and yet we have to deal with this as a region. There are also major gaps in terms of the root causes generally of any migration event, of whether migrations are forced or not, of the measures that need to be taken to both protect the people who are on the move or communities that are vulnerable to climate change, but for the moment are trying to retain their livelihoods in the places where they live. We also need to stop this rhetoric that characterizes migration as a negative phenomenon. We have to accept that it is a natural part of adaptation to climate. It has been so since prehistoric times. In this region, we had a very large movement of people in the Bronze Age in response to a naturally driven form of climate change. And so we need to accept and to draw up measures that understand that migration is a normal phenomenon, and we need to be able to deal with that. And I know that might be radical for some people, but this is really what comes out of the literature. So in terms of risk, so how do we move on from this? We need to find out, actually there are three major questions. What areas are most at risk from climate-driven migration? This could be areas which are at risk of losing people to migration. So in other words, the abandonment of the land, of cultural heritage, of livelihoods. Also regions which might be welcoming people who are migrating. So again, this will change the social balance and the social cohesion parameters of those areas. Those areas might already be under stress from climate change themselves. So what else? What is the exact causal nature of this climate migration nexus? It's easy to say that climate will drive migration, to make big statements, but what is the exact nature of this interaction between climate and the movement of people? What willingness exists in the region to work together as a region? I think I know the answer to that, but it's nevertheless a question we need to answer. And so in order to address these challenges, the first recommendation measure, we thought that we had a range of climate adaptation, climate mitigation measures that would also address the migration issues. But in reality, we can't do any of this until we understand what's going on. And so the idea is to create a climate vulnerability, a climate and migration vulnerability index, which we could call CLIMIV for short, or if somebody has a better acronym, great, which will really help international organizations, governments, civil society organizations, and communities themselves to create, first of all, to understand which areas, which communities are the most vulnerable, and then work with those communities to make them more resilient. Just to show you where this fits into the whole context of the panoply of recommendations. So we have the CLIMIV index, and then after that, this will enable us to do a whole range of things. One is, for example, the control of participatory approach to control of vector-borne diseases, especially in migrant and refugee camps, of creating an enabling environment to channel climate-driven migration. The climate oases deals, which the idea here is to create green jobs, climate adaptation jobs in areas which CLIMIV has identified as the most vulnerable to climate, in order to create livelihoods on the spot, to replace the livelihoods that might be being lost because of climate change. And then the biodiversity oases, which is really the idea of recognizing that although climate change is an existential challenge, so is the loss of biodiversity. And the loss of biodiversity has been going on, again, because of human causes for much longer than climate change. And it is actually not, cannot be considered as a completely separate issue, because biodiversity is in many ways a buffer against the effects of climate change. And when you start eroding biodiversity, you also erode your capability to deal with climate change. So the climate migration and vulnerability index. This is what we want to talk about today. It's all about evidence. So this will be an evidence-based policy tool that will be used by policymakers, hopefully in the majority of countries in this region, so that we can also have comparable data. And we can then have cooperation around this to identify climate-driven migration hotspots in the region. To go beyond just a gut feeling to actual evidence-based policy making. It has to precede, as I mentioned, all the other policy measures, because without this, essentially, this tool would be shining a light in the dark to try and understand what we should be doing and where we should be doing it, and address all these knowledge gaps that were identified in the report. It's all about also facilitating community engagement, as is the next measure, because the CLIMIV will very much be a tool grounded in what SEED, our partners from SEED, call the participatory action research. So you make people, communities who are the target of the research, you actually make them part of developing the questionnaire and the analysis tools. The next measure, as I mentioned, the idea would be to reduce the incidence of vector-borne diseases. Vector-borne diseases are on the move because of climate change, and they are following people around. People who are trying to escape from these diseases cannot, partly because of climate change, and the situation in refugee camps in particular is pretty dire, because they don't have the means necessarily there to deal with these problems. And so dealing with this is one of the measures that we propose. The Climate Oasis deal, creating green jobs to create community resilience on the spot. And then on the policy side, policy frameworks that include, that acknowledge, openly recognize climate-driven migration as a fact. It doesn't mean that we need to develop in fact, many organizations would disagree with creating a status of climate, a separate status of climate refugee. It's not about classifying people. It's more about understanding that climate-driven migration is already happening, and to have frameworks in place to deal with that. And then the biodiversity oasis, as I mentioned, creating that nexus between protecting biodiversity and dealing with the climate threats, which are actually one and the same thing. So let's go now to our tool. So this would be a digital tool that can be used by policymakers, international agencies, NGOs, local communities, which brings together two very different sciences. And this is the trick, and this is the challenge. And I think there a lot of progress has been made, not just by SEED with the score index, but also with the Groundswell work, where you need to bring together the climate scientists. So for example, the Cyprus Institute has climate models for this region, but also the social scientists, to see how we can connect models of climate change in the region, predictions and projections, with models of social cohesion to identify these hotspots and to identify what to do about it. So it's very much a mapping tool. It would be very visual, but also it would come with a kind of a toolkit of best practices of how we can, once we know where to work, of how to work there. It would provide an early warning system so that we can identify problems, hopefully before they happen. But how do we go about this? Well, this is actually the subject of this entire workshop. We actually have three options, and my approach would be to actually go for the third one, but let's go through them. On the one side, we have this wonderful index, the score index, which Bertrand has done a lot of work on integrating into the report, the social cohesion and reconciliation index, which allows us a lot of sophistication in terms of both involving people in the research. So it's a form of citizen science, but also in modeling social cohesion, societies at risk, and also, as SEED has been doing more recently, connecting it to resilience modeling. It's very good also at mapping issues and the visualization of the data. And then we have the World Bank Groundswell approach. This has actually been deployed in other regions, in sub-Saharan Africa, in all sorts of other regions, and Kanta can tell us a bit more about that afterwards. But again, these are scenario-based models. It's a revolution in modeling, really, and again, trying to bring together the climate data and the social data. The third option, which is probably the most rational, is actually to combine these two methodologies into a tool that is appropriate for this region. So this is essentially the discussion today. Who wants to join us in this initiative? Where can we pilot this? Where can we try this out? Which parts of this very wide region? Where can we find money for this? At the end of the day, it's always going to be about that. How can we get people on board, governments, international organizations? When do we start? I'd like to start yesterday. And what did we forget? What are we forgetting here? What are some logical first steps that maybe we've just gone a little bit too fast and we've skipped? So I don't want to say much more at this stage. I just wanted to give you kind of an outline for those of you who didn't have a chance to read the report. What I'd like to do now, before we take any questions, please keep your questions in reserve. I'd like Bertrand to give us a quick overview of the SCORE methodology, and then we'll move over to Kanta to tell us a few words about the Groundswell methodology, and then we can open up the discussion. So Bertrand, do you think you'd be able to share your screen?
Yeah, sure. I will share my screen if I find a way to do it. Where do I go?
At the bottom, you have 4 options, 4 buttons, and one of them is screen.
Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, sure. Obviously. Okay. We will present that together. It's 7 slide. Maybe Chris will start it to introduce you SEED and the SCORE methodology, and then I will continue just to present some ideas about how to integrate this, how to use the SCORE methodology within this CLAIMIV index. Can you see my screen, right?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Over.
Okay, it's very clear. Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah, and I'm very pleased to be with you all today. I know Cyprus very well. I'm sorry I can't be there. Unfortunately, I'm in the UK. So the SCORE index is the Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Index. And maybe just 2 words on background, which I think is actually quite useful. This index was developed under UNDP in Cyprus as a way to try and understand routes to resolving the Cyprus conflict. So it's overall it's an assessment tool which measures socio-political and economic phenomenon underpinning social cohesion, and it uses advanced data analysis techniques to identify causal relationship between these different phenomenon, and as a result it seeks to try and develop both program and policy recommendations which are based in evidence. Now, the attraction, of course, always has been, particularly in the world of peace building, of which I would consider this discussion to certainly be part of, given that climate change is one of the factors which underpins many conflicts in the region we're talking about. Okay, and of course, the breakdown of social cohesion is not unattached or disconnected from the movements of people as well. So the goal always was to try and bring some real evidence to the narrative of peace building, something which has become a lot better in recent years. But certainly when we started back in 2011 with this project, was not necessarily as prolific as perhaps it should have been. So maybe Bertrand, you can move to the next slide.
Yeah.
So the utility of the SCORE is, as you can see here, is really to support country-specific phenomenon along the lines that I've just described. It is multi-systemic, so the idea is that we do bring together different factors from different disciplines: politics, sociology, psychology, the environment, and that we find a way to contextualize these factors in a framework that can be responsive to the outstanding policy policy frameworks of the day. So, you know, be it a peace process like we did in last year in South Sudan, the comprehensive peace agreement that that we were asked by the UN to try and provide some advice on concrete, tangible trajectories for advancing that peace process, okay? Or be it, for example, in Liberia, the work was very much connected to trying to identify ways in which one could prevent electoral-related violence. There was a significant transition of power in 2017 in that country. So at the bottom there, you see several boxes. So these are the domains where we think that the score index can have a meaningful impact, be it preventing political violence or building community cohesion. You know, and I think there were several others. For example, gender mainstreaming, and the point that I think Bertrand will talk about in some detail later in a moment on preventing migration, and particularly we've looked at factors related to the phenomena, particularly in Eastern Europe, with migration of people, which has caused a brain drain in various communities. So maybe we can move on, Bertrand. And I think what I will say at this stage is that the score, Nick, you mentioned earlier on in your presentation, you talk about mitigation, you talk about prevention. Okay, so I think the score's real value here is looking at how to address the root causes of the drivers of the kind of socio-economic and political phenomenon, which are you know, the major challenges that are confronting us today, and finding ways in which we can actually prevent that cycle. Now, whether it be a conflict cycle or be it a cycle of migration, and I think this is perhaps where we should probably focus our attention, our energies in looking at that prevention dimension, which I guess brings me to what you were also saying earlier on about the participatory nature of the score. And I think this is something which is very important in allowing us to understand the relevance of the score to the social, economic and political realities of ultimately the beneficiary communities that we're trying to support and help. So we have a process framework here, and if you look at the circle, I'll just go very, very briefly and very quickly, where we intend to try and assess and identify the drivers of the challenges that people face. And that very often involves ensuring that we calibrate the score to the specific country or regional context. It can actually be done at a variety of different levels. It could be done at a national level, it can be done at a regional level, it could be at a sub-regional level. In Bangladesh at the moment, Bertrand and me are actually doing something which is a very, very local community level. We've been asked to do this by a major humanitarian development agency. So this process cycle of identifying the challenges and then being able to use the backbone of the score, which is effectively a household survey. So it's a survey of people, and what the score brings to you is the attitudes and behaviors of individuals, which we then use levels of abstraction to identify specific structural factors that can help to provide recommendations both programmatically or in the policy domain. So maybe you can move on, Bertrand. So this is the cycle I was just referring to. So we do a calibration process in country. We understand the country context, the participants in the score, the beneficiaries actually help us to design the questionnaire. Then the questionnaire is designed, data is collected, there is data analysis, which involves any host, any number. There's several advanced data analysis techniques in the toolkit, such as cluster analysis or regression analysis. And then there's the interpretation results, and finally the drafting of policy recommendations, which of course is not a a very static or mechanical process, because at the end of the day, development is all about the interaction between different stakeholders in the process. And the beauty of the score, one of its real strengths, is creating that framework for dialogue, which actually is a top to bottom dialogue when it's done at its best. So we can move on, and maybe this is where you will pick up the story, Bertrand.
Yes, yeah, thanks, Chris. So the idea of our presentation here is to start thinking about how we can use the SCORE methodology that Chris just presented you briefly now, and it could be okay. We could start with many questions. I just mentioned few of them: how to prevent climate migration, for example, or what are the drivers which help people to cope better in face of adversities, how to facilitate the social integration of displaced people. When I was listening to you also, Nicola, you were thinking about collaborative approach. So what are the drivers which push people to develop collaborative approach? What are the people who are most at risk, etc., etc. So there are all these questions can be asked and can be calibrated and answered by our score. The score methodology, the score approach is, we have a list of indicators basically that we can use and then assess this, evaluate these indicators and try to understand what indicators are driving others. We can do a lot of analysis, cluster analysis, etc., etc. And recently we used the resilience analysis. We did that recently in Liberia and in Mali. And I think this is the way we should target our approach from this CLIMIV. The idea of this approach is to understand basically what are the negative factors, the negative drivers, or the adversities. We can call that like that, and also on the other side, which are the resilient factors. Okay, and in the middle, we want to assess a specific outcome. Here, I just put tendency to migrate, for example. So we want to understand which adversities push people to migrate, and on the other side, which factors help people to stay and to cope better with the adversities. This could be a way to go. But according to the previous question I was mentioning before, here we could have a totally different conceptual framework. Okay, so it could be in yellow, we could have integration of the displaced people, and then we could see what are the adversities, or what impede people to be integrated in their hosting communities, and on the other side, what help people to be integrated. So all these things depend from the research question, basically. And here I just put several negative drivers and several resilient factors up to my I just put it like that. So we can imagine that what pushes people to migrate is the exposure to natural resource scarcity, for example, or the exposure to climate and physical adversities, high level of marginalization, economic security. All these factors could potentially drive to migration. And on the other side, we have other skills, knowledge, competencies, drivers, assets, which could help people to cope better in face of this adversity, such as savings mentality or access to public services, such as road infrastructures, etc., etc. And how does the score works is that each of these boxes of this indicator is calibrated, conceived, constructed within our questionnaire. So for example, here I just put an example for you to understand. Here the idea is to assess the economic shocks that people faced in the last 12 months, in the last year, for example. So we just mentioned a series of economic shocks that people could potentially face, price volatility, destruction of crops, family disease, root blocks, bad crops, unemployment, etc., etc. And then we can assess the level of economic shocks that people are facing. So this is how we assess our indicators. We have, of course, a big library of indicators. We can develop other according to what we aim to do. But this is how this is the general approach, basically. I think I will stop here and then we can discuss. And if you need more information from more details, we can provide that. Thank you.
Bertrand, thank you very much for that overview. Actually, off the top of my head, I would add access to energy or energy poverty as one of the economic shocks. We saw what happened in Lebanon recently. They essentially have no more access to energy. And I think this can be a major driver for people. And of course, energy links to climate change, especially the energy choices that we make. So this could be also a very important connection with the energy task force. I'd like to invite Kanta just to, I know you don't have a presentation because we just discussed this not long ago, but if there's anything you would like to say about the Groundswell methodology, which I think is quite different in some ways, or the Groundswell report more generally.
Thank you, Nick. If you indulge, I do have a few slides that may be visually more easy to absorb the methodology.
Even better.
Great. Let me know if you see the slides.
Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to. Gosh, there's so many things open on my screen that I.
If you put it in.
Yes, I am going to. Okay, great. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you the Groundswell methodology in particular. So that's what I'll focus on at your request, Nick. So very quickly, to keep it short, the World Bank started to work on this particular issue with a focus on internal climate migration. It was really driven by the impetus to understand what would be the scale and the magnitude and the trajectory of this issue in the face of changing climate, and to get a sense of the bigger picture. And we focused on internal climate migration largely because of the climate migration development nexus and our role as a development institution, but also because I think 3 out of the 4 people who do actually move also move within their countries. The second focus we had was that we really looked at slow onset climate change with a focus on 3 aspects: on water availability, crop productivity, and sea level, compounded by storm surge. So this is a little different from looking at sort of the basic variables of temperature and precipitation, because these really do look at climate impacts and impacts on livelihoods and opportunities in the ground. And the third dimension was we focused on a time scale which took us up to 2050 so that we could really inform near and midterm planning horizons for development planners. Now, there were some questions, and I like the way SCORE put out some questions as well, and I think that's always helpful to understand what we are doing. So in our context, in the Groundswell, we were really looking to understand what would be that scale of movement, how many people could be moving as a consequence of the spatial population shifts, what are the potential hotspots, that geography and the spatial dimension was important, and to really understand to what extent climate change is a driver, and setting out the context of the potency for climate, recognizing that migration, as you quite illustrated earlier, that it is, multiple factors act on it. And then what are the implications for medium and longer term planning? So really it's to focus on that particular issue to support countries to understand where this could go. And so what did we do? We really set out, as you indicated, a scenario-based approach. And we started with what we call the pessimistic reference scenario. This really combines, high emissions as we have in the RCP 8.5 in the context of the IPCC language, and the unequal development, which is a shared socioeconomic pathway 4. And to that, we had 2 alternate pathways to look at really how that differential works out. And what we have here is, a more inclusive development pathway, which really looks at high emissions combined with moderate development, and then more climate friendly, which is low emissions RCP 2.6, in line with the Paris Agreement and unequal development. And what we did here was to really bring together the global data sets that are the best that we have available from the IPCC and the EMME models and the gridded population of the world, the demographic models. And we brought that to bear in what we call a 14-kilometer grid cell. I might add here that we did this with leading geographers, demographers, and scientists from the Potsdam Institute, from Earth Institute and Columbia University, and the CUNY Institute of Demographic Research. So what we did next was to really, after having those effects at that level, to look at the estimates of climate migrations at that grid level and comparing that with where the climate impacts play out against those where there are no climate impacts. And then the third part was really to aggregate that upwards in the national level and then up to the regional level as we present the results. But the modeling itself is done at the 14-kilometer grid level. So what are some of the sort of back end of the methodology that may be interesting for this group? The first is that we use what we call a population gravity model to isolate out the portion of future climate migrants distributed over the slow onset factors. These plausible scenarios then characterize both the scale of the issue and, as you will see in a minute, the spread of the climate migration through their hotspots. And we use, as I indicated, these crop and water simulations, which have a direct relevance to livelihoods. And in the context of sea level, we didn't just use the sea level, but we looked at really the impact of storm surges, which can really reduce the habitability of those areas. And then what we also did was to contextualize our results against the literature. I won't go into length at this, and these are really some of the back end of the modeling work, where the model and the coefficients were developed based on the historical signal from 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2010, and then projected forward. In the original model, we looked at crop and water. Since then, we have expanded the model and we brought in this additional variables that are highlighted in yellow, which is the net primary productivity, because the EMME data has that now available. We also brought in non-climate factors, looking at the median age and sex, and then we layered in the data from the ACLED for the conflict-related issues. And so these coefficients are then plugged into the grid level analysis. And you can see here at the bottom, the sea level. So what did we get? This is the global snapshot that is presented in the Groundswell Part 2, which really sets out the scale of the issue across the 6 regions that we've looked at: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, which were done in Groundswell 1. And then now we've added North Africa, Eastern Europe, and East Asia. And you do find that the poorest and the most vulnerable areas will be hardest hit, but at the same time, no region is immune. So it's interesting that Sub-Saharan Africa, not surprising, has the largest number. But what I think is interesting is that North Africa, although it has 19 million, as a share of the population in 2050, it actually represents the highest percentage in the order of 8 to 9%, compared with the global of about 3% and Sub-Saharan Africa about 4%. So I think that differentiation is important to understand. So quick results on sort of how the scenarios play out, and you can see the trajectory here. The pessimistic reference scenario, not surprisingly, would lead to consequences of higher level of climate-induced migration. And then, of course, as you move towards more climate-friendly, it does reduce the scale. I might add here that these are the sort of aggregated to the region from the country level. When you begin to look at individual countries, the models can play out differently. For example, in the case study that we did for Ethiopia, because of the anomaly of climate models in the Horn of Africa, and the RCP, the warmer potential, gives more precipitation, it also does affect the way the results play out. But nevertheless, I think across the 6 regions and the sub-regions that we looked at, like in the North Africa, Lower Mekong, Central Asia, Central America, we find that the two reports do reaffirm climate change as a potent driver. Locality matters, as we mentioned, but we find that the trends are quite persistent in the context of warming and sort of unequal development can lead to worse consequences. And this is a comparison across the three scenarios. And what I think is important to take away in this is that both good development and climate action can reduce the scale of the issue quite significantly. The exact scale in a country, as I was illustrating, would be different. But let me also share with you, I think, a dimension that is particularly relevant to your own work here, and that is the hotspot analysis. Because we do the spatio-temporal gridded analysis, we are then able to bring out where it is that people could be moving into and where they could be moving out from as climate in and out migration. And we find that these hotspots could emerge as early as 2030, and they continue to spread and intensify under the scenarios that we look at. And the factors driving the in and out mobility would depend on the local context. For example, in the case of Egypt, which I know is one of the countries in your region, not a surprise that the Delta area would see some levels of dampening of population. We do not sort of say people are going to move out and empty out of those areas, but there's a dampening of the population growth in that area because we're also projecting populations forward. But then what are sort of some of the options available in the way in which we can begin to plan and prepare for some of these, because the hotspots in themselves are not predestined. It really depends on what you're going to do. And I think in that context, the work and the proposition you have in your methodology is very interesting and very important to bring in what are the adaptation options and what are some of the opportunities for that. I won't go into this case study, but it's really spelling out how we look at the land use and the anthropogenic biomes that interact with the population and climate factors. We did not do the Middle East and the small island developing states in the modeling context for different reasons, because the baseline populations in the Mashrek population census were not available in a way that we could sort of model it. And in the case of small islands, that some of the islands are just too small for the scale at which we were modeling. But we do qualitative analysis, and we dug into the literature that I think is available in the report. I may not go into that. But in terms of the policy level, the high policy messaging is that, there are sort of 4 takeaway actions. One, of course, needless to say, we need to cut the greenhouse gases, which will reduce the climate pressures that themselves fuel and drive climate migration. But the second is, I think, migration is a cross-cutting issue, and we really need to embed it into our planning and development planning. And not just for what is happening now for individual crises, but really taking that longer term horizon to bring that into the planning processes. But further to that, I think, is how do we make sure we look at each phase of the migration? So in some ways, I think this core card is very important because it helps us to really delve into the issues that are at play in the context of before people move, during, and after. And I think looking at those 3 phases is important, but also over a larger temporal context so that we can avert some of these in a sort of a far-sighted manner. Finally, we do think that this analysis, which is more model-based, would really benefit from sort of the participatory type work that you're doing. We're extending that into some of the work ourselves in Kenya that we're doing, and I think we have been working with the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative that is working also with the Danish Refugee Council on some of this, looking at the hotspots and understanding what's happening at that local level. And lastly, I think beyond the sort of 4 core policy directions, we believe, at least from the sort of interplay of larger spatial approaches and planning, that there are these action domains that we believe policymakers need to bring into it. And this addressed both the context of migration as a development option, but migration also where we need to sort of take far-sighted approaches. So adopting the far-sighted landscape and territorial approaches. So it's not managing one locality in itself, but looking at where there could be movement in and out within a broader context, especially in countries with large coastlines. And at the same time, how do we harness climate migration for jobs and economic transitions? In many areas, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, where populations are going to double by 2050, how do we make sure that any such movements really has the preparedness for the kind of jobs and economic transitions, harnessing the youth bulge that will happen in some of these countries? We do believe that the humanitarian development and peace communities have worked very much in silos, and really there is an opportunity to bring that much more in a cohesive way and in an integrated fashion. And good to note that I think that is already being done. I know at the World Bank we have projects with the UNHCR, you know, in the Rwanda and Burundi case, where we are looking at host-migrant relationships and investments that really work on both ends. And then the last is to domesticate policies and bridge the legal gaps. So let me stop here, and thank you really very much for this opportunity to share with you.
Thank you very much. At this stage, before we go into the big questions, I'd like to see if anybody has any comments or questions on anything they've seen so far. Okay.
I have a question, if it's okay,
yes.
Nick, just one quick
Yes.
question. I just
Yes.
wanted to understand a little bit about the SCORE methodology, whether it's focused on sort of current context in terms of where there are issues, or whether it's looking in a broader context. I mean, I think it lends itself to both, but I was very interested to know what your focus would be.
I think I'll let Chris or Bertrand answer that one. Chris, you're muted.
Beg your pardon. Thanks for the question, and thanks for that presentation. That was really, really interesting. And I'm gonna look this up now. So I'll spend the rest of the afternoon looking up your method. But you are right. It's both. But I think the important thing to state is that we try to contextualize the research very much to the realities of the communities that we're trying to support. So we have, okay, of course, there are a number of principled pillars for the score, and to some extent those are established by the score library of indicators. And what we have found across so many of the projects is, regardless of the context, very often we find that people gravitate. When I say people, the groups that we work with to calibrate the score, often they gravitate towards the same cluster of indicators. Okay, so there is some uniformity there. But we also find that there may well be difference of emphasis depending upon the cultural or the social, the political dimensions. May be a bit of a difference in emphasis depending on what the donor it actually has a particular interest in. So in Bangladesh, the emphasis at the moment is food for peace. So we're gravitating towards that nexus of food for peace. In South Sudan, which was, I think, a project I mentioned earlier on, the UN system wanted to understand what were the drivers for people to support the peace agreement. Okay, so different emphasis. However, we often find that there is a similarity or some kind of uniformity around the cluster of indicators that we do work with, and at the same time, we have the flexibility and right from day one, the openness to actually develop indicators which are which emerge as a particular demand to the context in which we're working in. Okay, so that's also something which helps to grow this library of indicators. So I guess it's a very long-winded way to respond to your question, which is yes, indeed. Okay, if there was a demand to understand, past issues and historic let's say, grievances and their connection to the demands of a research portfolio that might require an understanding of contemporary issues, then of course we definitely have the flexibility to do that.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. I'd like also just to hear briefly from Manfred in terms of the MEDEC group around the Mediterranean, if through the work that you're doing on the migration special report, I mean, I know it's early days for you, but if you might already have come across some similar conclusions, or if you've gone in a different direction, or you're going in a different direction.
Thanks, Nick. For actually, I was gonna raise my hand, so to speak, as well. No, but first of all, we're not, I mean, not as far along as we would hope to. But that notwithstanding, I think some of the things that I've learned today and earlier in reading the report are certainly similar to what we have in mind as well. What I'm really impressed about was the semi-quantitative modeling work that has been done, but and that's something that you know, we might want to get into as well. I mean, the index, the Climate Migration Vulnerability Index work that you have been doing, I think would also be a framework that we could adopt in our report as well. Of course, our study area is somewhat different. It includes the Western and more of the Southern Mediterranean, and not so much the Middle East, etc. So in that regard, I think there are similarities, but I do have two, well, very basic questions, which probably just indicate my ignorance or my obvious non-expert knowledge of the whole subject. I found really, again, as I said, I found really interesting the approach that you're taking, but I was wondering to what extent, and that goes probably to Bertrand and to Chris, to what extent in your library of indices do you capture cultural, traditional, if not religious, say, connotations or influences that may play a role for people when deciding or when being driven to migrate. And the second question that probably goes to all of you is, and again, you may have long answered that, and I just haven't seen that. But how do you, or do you capture at all conflicts between different groups of migrants while they're migrating, and how does that play out in terms of the numbers of migrants and their general fate, so to speak? I think I'll leave with that for the time being. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think, again, Chris and Bertrand, you might want to answer some of that, and then we can move on to how this CLIMIV index can actually become a reality.
Bertrand, do you want to take a turn?
Yes, I can. Hi. So about taking in consideration the cultural aspect, we can totally do cultural or religious aspects. We do that. For example, I was thinking about what we are doing now in Bangladesh about this food and security project, when we will try to take in consideration the way they cultivate the land, the jum, burn and slash, this kind of agriculture. So this is something that we can catch, and we can catch it according the ethnicity, according the age, and we will try to see as well. I think we plan to see that if this kind of culture is keep transmitted, or if the young generation are reluctant to use that, if they can convince the elder generation that they should stop that. This kind of aspects can definitely be taken in consideration. This mainly relies on what Chris was explaining on the calibration part, on the first part of the process, which is talking with the communities, which is involving them in the research project. So this is totally doable. And I forgot your first question, Manfred. What was it?
Question was, do you look at conflicts between groups of migrants while migrating, and how that plays out in the overall, let's say, development of migration from a particular place to somewhere else?
Okay. For
saying?
what sorry. From what I remember, Chris, I don't know exactly if we properly studied apart from the project in Ukraine about brain drain migration, I don't think we properly studied migration. Migration tendencies.
Because we haven't. You're right, and it's because it's not because we haven't wanted to. it's because at the end of the day, we haven't really been involved in a project which has been specifically focused on the socio-economic and political phenomenon of migrants.
But what we can definitely assess is sorry, go on, Fred.
What I was going to say was, so you look at the group of migrants more or less at a homogeneous group. Is that correct?
No, Manfred. What I think that no. What I was saying was that okay, so we've had one project in Ukraine where we have looked at the phenomenon of immigration, of people leaving Ukraine. I think it was also Moldova, but looking at the reasons why they were doing that, rather than looking at the question of conflicts or interactions or relations between different groups of migrants. We haven't had such a project like that. But I think what Bertrand is saying very clearly is that and just to go back to something we've both said already, when we calibrate a score project, and this is one of the things which perhaps is quite unique about the way we do things, is that we really take a lot of time and effort to actually understand the parameters of the research that's being demanded, and to contextualize that research according to the realities of the I would call them beneficiaries, the people that we're trying to serve through the outcomes of the project. So the simple answer is, if we were if there was a if we decided that there was going to be a project in which the project demanded that we needed to consult with different groups of migrants, be it in their home countries, or be it in some kind of refugee camp, or be it in their target countries of current residence, that can definitely be done.
Okay.
Absolutely, that can be done.
Thank you very much. Thanks both.
And also basically assessing the intergroup relation between these people. This is something which we do usually, not specifically for migrant, but assessing conflict between ethnic group or religious group or intergroup relations in general, trust between social groups. This is something that we do.
Nick will know this very well, because this is actually how SCORE started. SCORE started principally as a project to understand the intergroup relationship between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. So we actually have quite a sophisticated methodology for that.
Exactly, and in fact, if I remember correctly, the original SCORE index was actually also looking at the impact of the degree of religiosity, for example, on attitudes towards this resolution of that conflict.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Absolutely. We were able to understand actually that in the Turkish Cypriot community, it had zero impact.
Actually, I mean, Manfred, the SCORE, the acronym SCORE, it stands for social cohesion and reconciliation. It started its life as a conflict resolution tool, as an early warning system for conflicts. But yeah, here the added element here is, of course, the climate change and the hard science of climate, which, as Kanta mentioned, there are ways of integrating climate science with social science. It's never easy, but this is our challenge, not just today, but I think for the next few years, is in developing this index, is really bringing together two communities of people who normally don't work together, social scientists and the climate scientists. In this respect, I'd like to move on to one of the key questions for this CLIMIV, or Climate Vulnerability Index. Is clearly, there are tools out there. The question is we need a small starting group of 2 or 3 partners, who can really make this happen. And so clearly SEED, I think could be one of those partners, definitely. We've seen the Groundswell report is a critically important methodology. And Kanta, you mentioned that it wasn't just the World Bank. You also worked with 2 or 3 universities. I think you mentioned Potsdam, I'm not sure. But how likely is it, do you think, we could maybe convince those partners that you worked with to work on something like this in this particular region?
There's a big demand for rolling out the model, and right now we're doing some deeper dive work with the African Union, led by the African Union, UNDP, and the World Bank, actually, as a partnership, together with IOM and the Climate Convention. So the reality is, I think we would be very interested to see some of. We haven't covered your EMME countries, obviously, because we focus on the regions that the World Bank is engaged in. But I think it's prospectively, there's a model out there. We've been refining the model, as I mentioned, in the Groundswell Africa work that will come out later this month. We've taken the model, which initially focused on crop and water and sea level, to bring in ecosystem productivity. You talked about biodiversity being critically important. And then we've also brought in non-climate variables, and flood risk actually also is modeled into that. So I think the question here is really which version of the model, right? Because we continue to sort of enhance it, trying to bring in realistically the parameters that would better define response and action at the local level. But a short answer to your the short answer to your question is, I think it's something we can explore with them. Particularly, I think the CUNY Institute of Demographic Research is where we do the modeling. And I know that they've been working with UNHCR as well. So yes, definitely, I think there's some interest. It's just going to be availability of time for the people who the demand has sort of skyrocketed.
No, I fully understand, and I don't expect you to sign on the dotted line anything. We're just brainstorming and trying to see who would be the key partners, but this will bring us later to the question of resources.
But maybe, Nicola, I have a question. Are you focusing on the entire region, or are you thinking of 1 or 2 countries where you would be applying this, your CLIM vulnerability index model as well? Then I think it makes it more sort of possible, right? And I think everybody would be interested on how we combine this sort of modeling with the contextualization and bring out the social cohesion and resilience and adaptation as you have it, which I think is the way to go.
I completely agree. I think if we try to do this for the whole region, right now it's a non-starter. It will become so expensive that we won't be able to afford it. I think we need to start with a pilot. I think that's how the SCORE started. It started in Cyprus as a model of the Cyprus conflict, and then it was tried out, rolled out in Bosnia, and then all the other places that Chris and Bertrand mentioned, in Ukraine and Nepal. And so definitely, I think we need to do something similar. We need to start with small steps, but steps that will give us enough. I would call it more than a pilot. I would call it a proof of concept. So proof of concept in one or maybe two different, maybe it would be better to actually have two different contexts, so we can also calibrate, because all these participatory tools will be different. The questions you ask will be different from one context to another. And at the same time, you need to balance that with the need to have comparable data.
Yeah.
So yes, I would say we need to try this out in one or two pilot countries. And actually, this brings me to the next question that was actually on my slide, is where. So in other words, where should we start? I mean, there are so many options in this region to choose from. In a way, you know, we could just hop over to Lebanon. There's plenty of work to be done there. We could work in Jordan, where effectively half the population of Jordan are one way or another refugees. These could be two contexts which also maybe have enough stability that we have partners there that we could, you know, universities that we could gain access, you know, and to actually work with communities there. When we were doing one of the other 5 recommendations, which is the biodiversity oasis concept, we had thought of the following pilot areas. One was the island of Lesbos in Greece, which is more on the receiving end. One was in the Red Sea part of Jordan. Another part was in the Nile Delta of Egypt, where you have this issue between urban and rural, and movements between, especially from rural to urban areas. Another one was Cyprus itself, but I think, you know, maybe the Nile Delta is actually a really good place to start, also in light of the fact that the World Bank, you've actually done a bit of work in Egypt. It's one of the overlaps between the regions you've looked at and the region that we're looking at. I think Lebanon, because we have a lot of contacts there that we can work with on the ground, and then possibly Jordan. But I don't know if anybody else has other ideas.
Nick, just one passing thought from me. In terms, at least in terms of the SCORE methodology, I think what would also help would be if it was possible to actually look at two contexts that are linked by the migration route. So if you're talking about the island of Lesbos, then obviously there are going to be communities there which originate from perhaps Syria, perhaps other parts of the Middle East, and then to be able to then do a study within the context of their origin. Because I would say that what we're trying to look at here are the push and pull factors. Okay, the SCORE is good at trying to understand both push and pull factors. So what are the factors that gave rise to people feeling that they had to leave, whether it was conflict or with and how was that related to climate change, and trying to understand also what are the factors which are potentially going to allow people to go back, to return. So I mean, if we're looking at a pilot that perhaps looks both at countries of origin and receiving countries may be a good way forward.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. I think we also need to bear in mind what Kanta said earlier, and what we have in the report as well, is that I think 70 to 80% of this migration will be within certain countries. And so we could look at the migration routes even within a single country, or like you say, a route that takes people from Syria maybe to Lesbos. Syria is difficult because it's going to be hard for us to work on the ground, although of course it is, you know, the Syrian conflict is a major source of migration over the last few years. So could we find an intermediate point? Could that intermediate point be Lebanon or Turkey?
Yeah, I guess I was just suggesting that as a model of thinking, and because actually it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
It could, because clearly there are you know, communities, people who have migrated from other Middle Eastern countries, and obviously they're not in in the same say hot war situation as Syria, but actually perhaps to some extent the reasons for them migrating are probably far more due to climate change issues or issues related to climate change or to social and economic phenomenon which has undermined people's livelihoods due to climate change. And that actually may be a more relevant way of looking at things, because if we're looking at Syrians, I would imagine in the vast majority of cases people are escaping the conflict. So that yeah, but I also agree, if we can, I also agree actually it would be cheaper, I suppose, and maybe more practical to look at migration within a particular country too, but it's also more likely that the reason people have moved is precisely because of socio-economic and livelihood issues, rather than maybe things to do with conflict.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with the approach. I think if we did a pilot or a proof of concept, looking at the whole route makes much more sense than looking at either just the end point or the start point. Whether that's within a country or between countries, I think we can decide later. I think the Syrian conflict is complicated because it's not just a question of access, of us being able to go there on the ground, but it's also a question of this huge debate about what started this conflict. What were the main drivers? Is it, there have been suggestions that this is one of the first large climate-driven conflicts because of the drought that happened just before it. There are also authors who, in the literature review that we did, who will adamantly say that this is really a political conflict and the climate was maybe possibly a complicating factor. So definitely, yeah, but the concept of looking at the whole route as a pilot, I think that makes a huge amount of sense. Does anybody else want to add on that particular part of the discussion on the kind of where? Manfred and Kanta, I saw you afterwards. So Manfred.
Yeah, no, so sorry, Kanta, if you want to go first, that's fine.
No, please
okay,
go
no,
ahead.
I think this is, thank you. This is really interesting discussion. What I'm wondering here, Nick, is really, because obviously, if we look at countries like Syria, obviously the sort of political connotations and the political background, so to speak, becomes very relevant. And I'm wondering to what extent we should or should not avoid moving into that, let's say, area of really looking at, say, deep political issues, rather than trying to take on a more, well, scientific, more objective, quote unquote, view on migration. Again, I guess we cannot really avoid looking at politics as well. But again, I'm just wondering to what extent we want to expose ourselves in doing this to criticism that most likely will come up if we really move into questions of, let's say, political responsibilities. Let's put it this way.
No, Manfred, that's why, I think Syria, ultimately we have to deal with Syria, but maybe not as our first pilot, because I guess what we want to do is also work with authorities who will welcome this work and who will maybe even contribute to it in some way. But Kanta, you had something to say.
No, I was just thinking that, there are many criteria, and Manfred, when he spoke, I further thought, as I was going to say the point, I think maybe just listing down the criteria and creating a matrix of what countries pop out, in terms of the multiple criteria, it just would put us in a better place on the selectivity, right? So, it is, like you said, driven by multiple factors, and I don't think that's any one right way to do it, but then you can sort of at least go back to the matrix and sequence things, and that might be more acceptable. The only other point I was going to add, and since Janet is here, I understand that the next COP will be in Egypt, and I thought it'd be particularly interesting as these issues begin to sort of ramp up and get attention, engaging, and if possible, with those partners, building a sort of robust way of looking at it, might also get some good traction if we have this year leading into it, not 3 months as you had earlier. So just a thought there.
Actually,
Before,
Janet, sorry, Chris, and then Janet.
Yeah, just one quick comment before I lose it. In a sense, in response actually to Manfred. So I do agree with you, Manfred. The reason why I think it's really important to make sure that our selection is carefully calibrated towards success, i.e. politics doesn't intervene and become a barrier to proving the concept, is because at the end of the day, and it's the comment you made, Nick, the authorities are really important partners in this process, because if the goal here is to try and formulate evidence-based policy or program actions, unless there is a very, very clear and a very clear route or very clear outlet for those policy and program actions, then the fantastic work that will be done will remain fantastic academic work. And I think the goal here is to try and ensure that robust work underpinned by good science finds the day of the light of day and is clearly translated into proper actions that make a difference. So having the relationship with authorities who have the responsibility, if maybe sometimes not always the power, to turn recommendations into concrete policy actions is really, really important.
Thank you very much, Chris. I totally agree with that. Janet, I was wondering if you wanted to say anything, especially on this idea of the connecting the pathway between COP26 and COP27. COP27 will actually be in our region of interest. In terms of that connector, is there anything that can be done?
Well, I mean, I think that hasn't happened yet, so I'm not going to comment on that until that vote will be taken at COP26. But it is, I would just make a note, an Africa COP presidency. So that is, of course, the whole continent of Africa, which is why Egypt, I think, has been mentioned as the nominee for the Africa group of nations. So there is a very interesting set of synergies there, especially when you look at the issues of climate vulnerability and migration, movement, conflict. I think we've got more conflicts currently on the continent of Africa than for decades. So when you look at all of those things together, it's quite significant. But I also wanted to pick up on the points that you were just making, including Christopher, on the question of policy making and data and analysis, because I think one of the things that people often forget when they want to criticize the policy level is that you can only really come up with good policies and start to implement them and allocate funding and all of the rest when you've got a good evidence base. If you don't have that, then we're just sort of shooting in the dark a bit. And I feel when and it was also interesting earlier on, we talked about the so-called development humanitarian nexus and the development climate nexus. Whenever that word nexus comes into the conversation, I think it generally speaking means chasm. And the two sides on either side of the chasm are fighting each other desperately, mostly for funding, but also for turf. And the use of the word nexus is an indication that we aren't there yet. So I think it's really necessary. We have got a new division in existence now as between sustainable development and climate, and it's pernicious, and we really need to do something about that. We go back and remember that the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 also came in 2015. That we had the Paris Agenda agreement in 2015, which is also the first time, I think, globally that all countries recognized climate as a rights issue, which is what links it directly across to the Sustainable Development Agenda. Of course, multiples of the SDGs are actually about climate, and they set it all out, whether it's SDG 13 itself on climate action, or whether it is the other SDGs on life on land, life on water, sustainable cities, and the rest. So there's already a really strong connection between the Sustainable Development Agenda and climate. At the same time, I think we have all, and I think Kanta, you will see this from the World Bank perspective, but others as well, put in a lot of funding and effort to raise capacity across governments, particularly, but not only in the developing world, to raise their statistical capacity, the data gathering, real-time disaggregated data, especially when it comes to the development side of the agenda. I feel we very much lagged behind when it comes to climate, and this is why I'm interested in this this potential project, because it sits in that sort of box that climate change is a thing on its own, disconnected from everything, or climate change is meteorology, and it's just weather statistics, of which there are plenty. And there are, you know, a lot of work has also gone into things like early warning systems when it comes to weather events, so that you can build some resilience. But there isn't, as far as I'm aware, there is not much that does exactly what we're all talking about today, which is bring together these different pieces of data into some sort of analysis, actually does some good collection of data, and I don't think it's good enough, which can inform decision making. It can also inform, even more importantly, the applications for funding, which go up to the global level and very often fail because they have inadequate data supporting them. And that's partly because it doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist in the right format when it comes to climate. So I think, and I think this is where the COP is taking us now. COP21 and this run all the way through to COP26 now is taking us to an area where climate really is, and the elements of climate really are elements that are now, and I hate the word mainstream because it's overused as well, but are now actually part of policy making of all governments. Every government in the world is having to do this, and I think the COVID crisis has really revealed a lot of weaknesses cutting across our systems, not just when it comes to supply chains and the big energy things that are making the headlines now, but across a whole number of areas. So this level of analysis and this approach to bringing together the underlying real-time data, you know, if you don't know what's happening and where it's happening, you can't really understand how and to what extent it is a driver of behavior, whether it's movement or anything else. And I think there's another point as well, which is that you have to look at it when you are thinking about informing policymakers, and I'll come back to that in a second. When you're thinking about informing policymakers, and when it's a question of migration, we need to think, yes, of the drivers of migration. Why? So that we can look at what to do to ameliorate the conditions or to act while people are en route. But you also have to look at what happens when they arrive at the other end. So there are two very different types of policymaker that you're talking about there, and in fact three if you include the migration route, the people en route. That's where our dear friends in IOM are the great experts. So what you're aiming for when you think about policymakers are different, yes, they may require the same sort of underlying data and analysis to support their decision making, but the types of decisions they're making are very different. And that brings me, I think, to the point that I started off with, which is policy making and the provision of this data and analysis. I think you would be very wise at this point to separate the two and say, this is already a very big and a very important piece of work to get to that point of understanding where challenges lie. And what is driving them, and what are the connections amongst the various drivers, and how do they play out? And this kind of an index that weights those things and plays them together is difficult enough to do in understanding the weighting you give to different elements that come in. And I would say putting the effort into refining that so that in and of itself the analysis becomes something which is trusted and something that governments and other policymakers would like to base their decision making on. We see many indices. There are lots of different indices that are there. Some are more relied upon than others. And the more that you can build a robust system, the more you will be able to see where the policy advice and recommendations can come in. But I think at this point, focusing on the policy recommendations and advice potentially takes you in certain directions that might influence the way you do the data and analysis. And I feel that the gathering of data and analysis on climate and its ability to mainstream and link across to development, to adaptation, to mitigation is a really, really important piece of work that has not been done anywhere else like this. So if you can manage to bring these things together and build that. It's very interesting to see both the World Bank crowdsourcing surge mechanism and the score mechanism with the slightly different approaches in this. Bringing them together in the way that you're suggesting that gives us also the conflict elements of it, I think is really important. And that in itself would be a big job before you get onto the policy recommendations end of things. Yeah, let me leave it there.
Thank you, Janet. I think that makes absolute sense. I think we're already biting off, I think, more than we can chew. So just this task of developing this index is going to be monumental. Manfred, I saw you. I'll give you the floor. And definitely, for example, when the score index started, it was actually given, it was started in Cyprus, and it was given to the leaders on both sides of the island. Of course, they interpreted it very differently, but at least we were able to, and we also made it public. So there was an expectation that the leaders would at least follow the facts in their decision-making processes. And then, policy making is for policymakers, but at least we're providing an even playing field and we're providing that light in the dark. Manfred.
Just a very brief comment. Going back to your early question, Nick, about the difference or the similarities between the MEDEC approach and your group. One major difference, I think, is indeed that we are not shying away. We're avoiding on purpose any sort of political recommendations or indications. We're like in our MEDEC report. We're rather stick to the sort of scientific, provable, and if possible, quantifiable facts, rather than trying to come up with any recommendations in the policy field, which does not, to be very clear, discredit or put down the work that you are doing. It's important, but I just wanted to mention that that's, I think, one of the major differences between our approach and your approach. Thank you.
Yes, Janet.
Yeah, hi, thanks. And something that Manfred said also just reminded me. I think it's also really important to say that right now, the climate issues, if I can put it this way, are very apolitical. In other words, populations are seeing them across party political divides, right, left, whatever it may be, and are seeing that climate changes or environmental changes, seasonal changes, temperature changes are things that cross borders and regions and have an impact on everybody. So even though it can then become politicized when you start saying, what do you do about it? The baseline analyses and narrative can actually, if you do it well enough, remain apolitical so that you can get the points across. Policymakers, if you present the apolitical facts very well, policymakers have no choice but to take them into account. And you don't have to get political in the way that you present these elements. There is now a very big consistency, and this is something that we've started working on when we work with youth, for example, and looking across the piece, that for the young people who are getting who are very worked up and want to do things and want to be part of it, to actually find the commonalities between communities, regions, even urban and rural. And I'm seeing much bigger splits opening up between urban and rural. And this is also a question of internal migration of a different kind. Urban and rural populations when it comes to climate and their resilience, their ability to withstand it, the overall, whether it's a livelihoods issue or it's any of the other social issues, this urban rural element is really huge. But again, if you can get in at those communities, the groundswell of opinion is generally speaking apolitical. What you do about it is another thing, and that's when people start campaigning. But this, I think there's a huge amount here that you can do without getting political.
Thanks a lot, Janet. That makes absolute sense, of course. Yes, Kanta, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to second the point about the apolitical nature of evidence-based approaches. I think what we found with the Groundswell, I think one of the reasons that the reception was quite favorable in most of the cases and almost all, even when we took the results to the countries, were that, you know, in all of the 6 regions we consulted in the case study countries, I think that there was total agreement and realization that these kind of plausible scenarios would play out. And we consulted with both the policymakers and with civil society and others, and sometimes separately and sometimes together. At no time was there a pushback that this was unrealistic. I think, in fact, very vocally, communities were saying that some of these patterns were already emerging and some of these stresses were at play. So I think they really welcomed that. And I think they also welcomed the fact that sometimes they hadn't given thought to the internal climate migration. A lot of the conversation has been about cross-border, and this almost like, not to say recalibration, this relook at the internal, for example, when we went to Mexico, was quite interesting. And I think this conversation is, and that's where I think it's within the policymakers' realm to do things. And we don't impose it on them, but I think it's a realization. And one of the countries said to us, we're talking about refugees, but this internal climate migration is going to reach a magnitude that we hadn't even thought about. And so I think it's, you know, I think so Janet's point about presenting the data, presenting the evidence, and I think now bringing a score into sort of the more contextualization of sort of model-based approaches can itself open up the dialogue to them internally, I mean themselves. And I think that's really very powerful than any sort of prescriptive policy approaches. They may look like an overreach, right? So just wanted to underscore that.
Definitely, and I think also we don't have the competence anyway to get involved in policy. I think what we can do is provide the facts, the evidence base with which policy can be made by policymakers. I'd like to welcome Rania Tsoraki, who contributed to the report from the University of the Aegean. Rania, we've kind of reached the final stage of the process, but I was wondering if you could just briefly introduce yourself in 1 minute, because you've played an important role in the discussions around this migration task force report. So if you can give us an elevator pitch of your background.
Okay, sorry that I couldn't connect earlier, but this is the first day of our classes. And we are full of people, of students around asking for information, and also the Erasmus students. So it always takes more than needed in order to arrange everything, especially the first day. So I'm a professor for environmental management, especially water resources management in the University of the Aegean in Greece. So in our islands, in Lesbos, in Samos and Chios, we host 3 RICS identification centers for refugees. And the last year since the crisis has started, I work also with the pre-integration of refugees, especially refugee scientists. That means that we offer several seminars, mentoring services to the refugees community, how they can continue their studies or how they can find a job in Greece or in Europe in general. And also some classes, Greek classes or informatics or programming, classes that they need high skills, more dedicated to highly skilled refugees. And in a way, we help also the pre-integration group, because all the NGOs here, they have all together, they offer classes. We have created a pre-integration group. And through this group, we offer training to trainees, in a way, because they don't know how to teach Greek, the volunteers, or how to teach English, or how to do several other things. And we try as a university to give them advices. And so I'm getting involved in several projects like SIREA and Bridge 2 and national projects. And this is my main activities related to refugee. In the last period, I also offer services related to the environmental management of the Refugees Identification Center to reduce the plastic, to increase the environmental awareness of the refugees that live there, and in general to make these centers more sustainable.
Thanks a lot,
of course,
Anya.
it's related to the subject. It's not the heart of the subject, but this task force, but we are close to that.
Thank you very much, Rania. Just to bring you very quickly up to speed, essentially, we've been discussing the climate and migration vulnerability index that we want to develop, which is the first recommendation in the report. We were discussing that we need to pilot this somewhere. Somewhere could be one country, so looking at internal displacement within a single country in the region, or it could be a full migration route, you know, starting somewhere and arriving somewhere else, for example, Lesbos. So this is something we've discussed. We've discussed methodologies, the Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Index developed by SEED, and also the Groundswell, the Groundswell report methodology developed by the World Bank and their partners. And we also discussed that we need to really, the aim here is really just to provide an evidence base. We're not going to go into defining policy for people in the region. That's the job of somebody else. What we provide is the facts. We look at which communities are the most vulnerable to climate change, how can resilience be built at any stage in the route. So whether people in their original communities or anywhere en route or anywhere, you know, on wherever there is their destination. So that would be complex enough to keep us busy for many years. And now in the final 10 minutes, let's say that we have, I wanted to ask the most difficult question of all is, even if it's just a pilot, we're going to need resources for this. We're going to need money at the end of the day. I know it's a taboo subject. We could very well sit there and wait for a European project to appear, like we did Rania for the biodiversity project. We were extremely lucky that as we were discussing this project, a call came out. But you could wait a very long time for a call, a European call that is both relevant and at the same time covers not just EU member states, but the neighborhood, because we're interested at the end of the day in the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East region. So something, you know, rolling something out, whether we follow the World Bank methodology or whether we follow the SCORE methodology or a combination of both or something else, even a pilot project, if we really want to look at a full migration route and talk to people and use a participatory approach and consult with, you know, work with NGOs and other stakeholders, this is a project that cannot cost less than $500,000. I mean, let's be clear about this. Rolling out the SCORE index, I remember in Bosnia, for example, just in one country cost I think more than $150,000, and that was just to look at social cohesion, let alone climate, you know, data. So we need to,
Nick, in Africa, yeah, the average budget for a SCORE project. So this is this is the SCORE project where the scores already been established, and we're basically just rolling out a methodology that's being tried and tested and all the rest of it. So now we're looking at something which you say is R&D plus piloting. So but the normal SCORE project, I mean, we're looking at anywhere between you know, 60 and 90,000 euros. So that's but as I said, but that's rolling out a project, that's rolling out a methodology that's already been tried and tested. That doesn't include all of the other bells and whistles that we would need to do as a prerequisite to rolling out a pilot.
Exactly. So let's imagine the amazing best case scenario where we somehow manage to roll out a pilot for the climate, the CLIMIV index for, let's say, $100 to $150,000 in the absolute miracle scenario. But still, we have to find that amount. So, of course, yeah, one option is obviously always EU projects, but with the caveat that aside from the neighborhood project, the ENI instrument, there are very few calls that involve non-EU member states as have the possibility of being funded partners. So there may be other options, but I don't know if anybody has any ideas on that subject at the moment.
Nick, is there any option whatsoever that COP itself could offer some inroads on this question, or is that just too complicated?
Well, COP is the conference of parties of the IPCC, but I mean, Janet can maybe better answer that question, but I don't think they're a donor organization. I don't know, Janet.
No, I don't mean it. I don't mean it in that way. I don't mean that they're a donor, but I'm just wondering whether that the so bear with me, because maybe this is not particularly coherent, but what I'm thinking is that the energy around COP and that, you know, because COP's going to be a circus of different partners. No, Janet, it's going to be a real circus in Glasgow, I guess. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, in that circus, are there going to be people or organizations who might be interested in looking at this as some kind of you know, innovation that in a sense would demonstrate a particular follow-up to COP, because COP needs to have follow-up. It needs to have concrete kind of tangible things that demonstrates that the world really takes climate change seriously. And I'm just wondering whether the circus could potentially offer that type of energy that we could, you know, jumping on the bandwagon, as it were, and tap into it in some way. I mean, as I said, I'm sorry, the thought isn't particularly coherent, but I'm just wondering whether it does offer an inroad in that particular perspective.
Well, potentially. I mean, the COP circus this time is going to be really huge. I mean, we anticipate up to 140 world leaders for the World Leaders Summit, which is enormous. It'll be the biggest summit the UK has ever hosted. And the 2 weeks of the COP, I mean, there's going to be a lot of intensive focus on what progress has been made so far, why more progress has not been made, and what you need to do to make better progress. One of the big elements in that is finance. And one of the reasons that people can't get good access to finance is that they don't have good data. Now, whether it is for the policy making, whether it is for project applications to implement policies, it's just not there and it's not good enough. I personally think that there will be underlying a lot of the discussions, some of them may well be upfront as well, this issue, particularly when it comes to adaptation and resilience, which is where a lot of this sits. This issue of poor data and analysis when it comes to specific issues of climate and the rest, and climate and the impact on people's lives, climate and the impact on social and economic development, social and economic progress, all of which can be, if we take it into the conflict side, which can be contributory factors, put it that way, I think that there is a great potential for one of the results to come out of COP to say, actually, we don't have good enough data and more needs to be done on it. So, you know, where this kind of particular proposal would sit in that at COP, I think it's too late, because I mean, it's only 20 days away or something. So, but coming out of COP, I mean, COP is just a moment in time. It's 2 weeks, right? So, you know, it will continue afterwards. So I think the momentum coming out of COP, especially if, as I anticipate, people will be saying, one of the things we need to do in order to be able to do more is get better data. So I think you're quite right. I think the momentum coming out of COP and picking up on those gaps in knowledge is a potential opportunity.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, exactly. So I think that there's the talking point just right there. To advocate on the back of COP, where the statement of intent will be, well, we need to have more data because we want to do better programming for climate mitigation or prevention issues. You know, we know that, particularly in Europe, that you know, there's a huge challenge and there are concerns about migration. from outside of Europe. And I suppose a very strong proposal could emerge from that, and from the energy that COP is obviously going to develop, and the recognition that there is a gap in the state of the art, and maybe that's where this proposal can find can position
Definitely.
itself.
And I would say that for me, the pitch should relate to adaptation and resilience, because frankly, there's loads of data on mitigation and emissions and greenhouse gases and methane and whatever you want to call it, where there is a gap. And this is also where I would like to see it linked across to sustainable development, is in exactly that. It is in the other elements. It is what impact do changes in water, temperature, wind, soil erosion, I mean, all of these things that go on over there. What impact do these have on socioeconomic growth, planning, development, even stagnation? Frankly, do they go backwards as a result of this? And what does that matter? And I don't think you can do it or should do it in isolation. I think adaptation and resilience, which is the underfunded, misunderstood, if you like, or not well enough understood element of all of this, is exactly the areas that you're looking at. It's the areas of vulnerability which lead to unpredictable outcomes that policymakers have to respond to.
Not least because resilience is a very, very elastic term, isn't it? And many people don't really understand what resilience means in many contexts. I mean, we've been working with this concept over the past couple of years, and we've been trying to, Bertrand inferred it. He spoke to it a little bit earlier on. So, trying to develop these kind of resilience factors. On one hand, you've got vulnerabilities. On the other hand, you've got resilience factors. And what you're trying to do is to be more in a more targeted fashion, identify the resources and the places where better coping strategies, if you like, can be employed by local communities to be able to develop this resilience against the impacts of climate change, and provide them with the skills and the tools, which, if they can do that successfully, actually, in a sense, becomes a way to prevent the push factor, to prevent them from in a sense resorting to migration as the only ultimate coping strategy that they may have to try and avoid the negative impact of climate change.
And if you really want a country that I think would be very interesting to look at in this context, I think Jordan is a living example of adaptation and resilience. I mean, that is a country that has water for 2 million people and currently is housing 11.5. So how do you actually get over? And it is absorbing the populations that result from problems around the borders. So it's a quiet center of calm and stability, relatively speaking, in comparison to everybody around it. But it is and I was there a couple of weeks ago, and people had started talking about in one of the academic interactions we had about dust, as they called it, but actually topsoil, essentially, blowing across the border from Syria into Jordan with the winds, which is depleting farmland on the other side that hasn't been farmed for years because of conflict, but is now degrading. So anybody who did live there and farm before, who might be thinking about returning at some point in the future, will find that they're going back to land that is even more devastated than they would have imagined before they left. So, there are some I think Jordan is actually a very fascinating example of adaptation and resilience in and of itself.
Okay. Manfred, you had a quick comment, then I think we need to wrap up. But Manfred?
Actually, in fact, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed talking to you. I do have to leave now, but I understand the meeting is drawing to its end anyways. But once again, I very much enjoyed talking to you, and I hope for other interesting and stimulating discussions in the future. Thanks very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Manfred. Before you leave, and everyone leaves, I put in the chat a link, because tomorrow, as part of this same conference, we're actually going to address this issue of climate and finance, the whole range from carbon taxation to insurance to the risk to developing countries that are borrowing in the context of climate change. the climate risk to borrowing and loans. So the whole climate finance issue will be dealt with tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Another online, well, it's a hybrid workshop, so actually those of you who are on the ground can actually attend in person. Yes, that would be another way to continue the conversation. I think I see this very much as a beginning. I think we have a really beautiful initiative here. I propose that I can write up our discussions today and the recommendation that came from the report into a concept note, maybe 2-pager, that we can start selling to people, talking to other people, finding partners who are not necessarily members of the migration task force, but who want to work with us on this. And I think we'll find a lot of willing partners around in Europe and in the region. So I think that's my proposal to you, and I can send this concept note to all of you to look at and to see where we can take this next. So thank you very much to all of you. Really appreciate. It's been a wonderful 2-hour session, and I look forward to seeing some of you maybe at the climate finance workshop tomorrow.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Okay, thank you, Nick.
Thank you, colleagues.
Thanks,
Thanks very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Nice meeting you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.